I'm Garvan Walshe, co-founder of Unhack Democracy and chair of this panel, which will really focus on state capture. We've heard about the sort of hard end of authoritarianism from Olga and the incredibly brave fight that Ukrainians are putting up against Russian militarism and aggression. But there's also a more insidious attack on democratic institutions that happens in many other countries that seeks to undermine them, erode them, and create a sort of facade democracy, what the Spanish used to call a mokratura, like halfway between a dictatorship and a democracy, where you keep all the processes going, but somehow all elections end up in one way, all public tenders come to the friends of the same person. Most profitable media ends up having a particular point of view. And as studying this phenomenon, of course, one of the most important institutions doing this has been Freedom House, and Mike Smeltzer will outline some conclusions from their recent Nations in Transit report. Unfortunately, these are not very, sort of positive conclusions, but it's a sobering indication of the task ahead. Once that's done, I'm going to open the discussion in a guided way to the panel. We have an immense group of experts here, whether it is Zgut, specialist on informal power at a number of institutions in Hungary and Poland. We have Miklós Ligeti from Transparency International, and we have the lawyer and activist Krzysztof Izdebski as well. So let us start, and after that, obviously, we'll open up to a wider discussion at the floor. So let's start with Mike and the rather sobering report that he has visited upon us.
Yes, unfortunately, Freedom House rarely has good news these days to report to the rest of the world. But a huge thanks to Unhack Democracy for this event and the invitation to do a panel around our report. We weren't sure anybody was going to read it because the news was so bad, to be honest. But for those unaware, Nations in Transit is one of Freedom House's annual reports that focuses on the state of democracy in the region stretching from Central Europe to Central Asia. And it focuses on institutional pillars of democracy and democratic resilience. So how institutions provide, protect, and support our fundamental freedoms. And each year, we evaluate these 29 countries on 7 indicators ranging from electoral processes to corruption to independent media, and then assign them a category of either consolidated democracy, hybrid regime, consolidated authoritarian regime, and others. And listening to Olga's speech, it's very moving and making me think a lot about sort of what we're going to be talking about with hybrid regimes. In fact, when we were writing this report, the hybrid regimes were really going to be the focus, but then the war happens, and we had to rewrite the whole thing. But nevertheless, they are connected. And so the title of our report this year was From Democratic Decline to Authoritarian Aggression, and we do see them as interconnected. That is, we can't say that it's these democracies or declining democracies' fault for Putin's unilateral decision to invade Ukraine, but nevertheless, what is happening in these countries with the democratic decline created an environment in which Vladimir Putin felt emboldened to invade a sovereign democratic country. And so this report documents the 18th year in a row of democratic decline. I'm tired of saying things are getting bad. Things have been bad for a long time. Demagogues are running roughshod over the rule of law and the separation of powers. As we'll talk about, as we know, elections seldom fair, even when they are nominally free. Governments regard these freedoms of association, assembly as inconveniences and not threats to their power in many of these countries. And judicial independence, which we should talk about, has been long warped by endemic corruption and is faltering in the face of abusive lawmaking. And so what does this mean? It means that liberal democracy is no longer the presumed form of governance and political development in this region. And in most of them, to be honest, this is not a trend that's unique to this region. Rather, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia are headed in what we call 2 different directions. One, the abyss of autocracy, that is Russia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, but also the gray zone of hybrid regimes. And this crowd knows what hybrid regimes means. It means democratic institutions are present, but they're married with sort of autocratic or authoritarian practices. And so, as much as I would love to talk about autocracy, because that's my specialty, actually, we should save that for the Unhacking Autocracy Conference. But really, it's the hybrid regimes, this insidious proliferation of these gray zone countries that is a real threat in addition to autocracies. In our report, at the start of the democratic decline 18 years ago, there were only 4 of the 29 that we identified as hybrid. Now there are 11. It's the predominant form of governance in this region. And to give a concrete example of what this looks like, take the independent media. In Russia, you have outlets like Medusa that are simply being out. But in countries like, say, Hungary or Serbia or other hybrid regimes, instead of shutting down independent media, they're being bought up by the regime or elites connected to the regime. And so, as I said, the number of these countries has tripled, and it's proven exceedingly difficult for these countries to exit what we call the gray zone. Rather, it has this gravitational pull where these countries are kind of going to the middle of our scale, and even the democracies are starting to head this way. Strong democracies in the Baltics and Poland. Hungary used to be one of these strong democracies and has come in this way. There is a silver lining, I will say. I want to point this out because the program says hybrid regimes run this risk of becoming autocracies like Russia, but we have not seen that yet, to be honest. There are countries like Armenia, Kosovo, Moldova that were once authoritarian regimes, at least according to us, that have become hybrid and have not fallen out. You can stretch that further back and look at Georgia or Ukraine, once authoritarian practices, and yet have not fallen back into autocracy. And that's no mean feat. That's really, really important to note and celebrate. Obviously, hybrid governance is not ideal. We know there's a better form in liberal democracy, but it's important to remember that they are not falling into the abyss of autocracy. And because I want to get to the other panelists who actually have solutions and hopefully good things to say, in our report, we talk about, what's the solution to this? And we think it's elections. Why? Because really we believe it to be the only solution. I mean, what are the other solutions? Regime change, revolutions? We know what the outcomes of those are. They're not good. Lots of deaths, lots of chaos, and nobody happy in the end. And currently, all these regimes, all these hybrid regimes hold elections. Yes, like I said, the elections are not free, they're not fair, but they have some level of competition that allows for a potential change. It is totally unfair, and it's very unlikely, but we do have instances of breakthrough elections. We can see things changing in places like Kosovo, Armenia, Ukraine. These are all examples of countries with not perfect institutions, but nevertheless, they are working in the right way because they have come together in these breakthrough elections to bring about change. That change is hard once these elections happen, and we can talk more about how do you reform once you come through this sort of difficult election. We don't really have many great examples. But for the rest of this, I want to leave it there. You're welcome to read our report, and happy to hear what our panelists have to say about how do we exit this gray zone, because it is really pulling many of these countries and much of the world into its gravitational pull. And I'm out of ideas on how to fix it. So hopefully somebody else has good ideas.
Thank you, Mike. This was a very important element just at the very end, where you talked about, how do we reform? We've just seen a reformist government in Bulgaria fall. We've seen pressure in the Czech Republic, I think just today, when these in countries where anti-hybrid coalitions have managed to seize power, they're then subject to lots of attacks from existing institutions. And I think there's perhaps nobody better to think about that sense of informal attacks outside the rules of the system than Edith. So if you're facing this kind of situation where you manage to finally get rid of the official institutional control, but they've all got these levers. They've got this patronage networks. They've got corruption networks that have been going around for several years. How do you then start to clean up the house after, if you can just win the election first.
Thanks, Garvan. And I also wanted to thank all the organizers to have me here. And as just Mike said, it's so difficult to report anything promising or like not gloomy nowadays about democracy. And when it comes to Central and Eastern Europe, definitely my country is Poland and Hungary that I'm studying, that the most gloomiest like news are coming from here. And before I circle back to the question of remedies, I just wanted to highlight a couple of ideas about what are we facing exactly? Because I think that what's most striking about Poland and Hungary, and not only these two countries, but the rest of Central and Eastern Europe as well, is that democratic deterioration is not primarily defined by the formal violation of the rule of law, which is very important. And we have been discussing all back and forth for years. But what's a little bit more difficult to address and to capture the essence is what's happening under the radar of the European Union and how Poland and Hungarian government are trying to undermine democracy with informal power tools. So I'm thinking about clientelistic corruption, media capture, and electoral clientelism. And if you all bundle this together, these have a lot more complex underpinnings than just state capture per se. So what we have been witnessing is that there are a lot of differences between Hungary and Poland. Just to highlight a few, in Hungary, private property is not even protected anymore, which has at the end of the day an impact on the integrity of the elections. The wealth of oligarchs totally is dependent on their personal relationship with Viktor Orban. And also the most deprived strata of the society, and I think that's very important, they're feeling like that they're being like tainted, like under the power of the government, they're being intimidated. And the way how they're tilting the playing field is, at the end of the day, is that these most deprived strata of the society, they are trapped in poverty circles. Poland is a little bit different because the property is protected, and I would say that low intensity coercion is mainly being put on judges and journalists, and we haven't been really witnessing anything like electoral, like coercive vote buying like in Hungary. But the problem is, and I think this is not being discussed in the European Union, that there is also an issue with clientelist corruption. So there is an issue with the public procurement system. Maybe Krzysztof is going to talk a little bit more about it. There has been like elements of abusing EU funds on the local level. So I think Poland also started to go beyond the formal violation of the rule of law, and there's many issues with clientelist corruption. And the problem is that this is something with which the EU is obviously struggling to address and focus on. And here I give a lot of credit to my colleagues from Transparency International, from Unhack Democracy, that they are trying to grasp and capture the essence and pinpoint to these problems, how these regimes are trying to tilt the playing field, not on election day, but in between elections throughout the whole year, every year. And cycling back about the idea of what to do about that, there are absolutely no easy answers, but I think there are still many things that the European Union could do to despite its shortcomings, because there are still many institutional shortcomings, the EU could do a lot more. So a lot more efficient withholding EU funds would be needed. Prevention, immediate legal actions would be, I think, utmost important, because that's something we haven't really been seeing in the last years. Rather appeasing Viktor Orban, and right now appeasing the Polish government. So what, for instance, could be done is that we could use our currently existing toolkit in a lot more efficient manner. Just to give you one example, for instance, we have a great single market scoreboard within the European Union. It's hugely underutilized and it's not being used properly. And I think that would also need to be further developed in order to prevent or slow down corrupt backsliding in these countries. And what could be also done is that besides developing it further, it could be a little bit more harmonized with the other toolkits which the European Commission has. For instance, we have the rule of law report, which is like a relatively new tool, not that under discussed, but I think, for instance, if the Commission could simply include the scoreboard, improve the indicators of this scoreboard and use it in a more harmonized way and focus on within the European, like the rule of law report, the Commission could better delineate the contours of clientelist corruption, the monopolization of the state and state corruption in these countries. And I think what's utmost important is, and this is about the future, because probably with Poland and Hungary, the ship might have a little bit sailed, and probably it's just a lot more better if the European Commission is focusing on those countries where the situation is not so bad, and try to think about the future and future like candidate countries which would like to access the European Union, to focus and put more emphasis on effective implementation and enforcement of these reforms and EU law, instead of focusing on this box-ticking mentality that has been happening with technically all Central and Eastern European countries that joined the Union in 2004. And this is why we have these informal problems in this region. And definitely like appeasing autocrats and letting them to slip away with symbolic compliances should be stopped, because what we have learned is that democracy dies with these kind of dirty compromises in value.
Thank you, Edith. Don't appease autocrats is the central message of that. I mean, someone who works very, very hard on this, especially at the EU level, is Miklós, and I know you've been thinking very deeply about the role of the EPPO, the role of the rule of law mechanism in how these tools might be used, if not necessarily in Hungary and Poland, at least to arrest potential decline in other states that have actually signed up to the EPPO, for example.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me here. And I know I was asked to not give a diagnosis because we have several diagnoses, and to show a way out, but I cannot. So I'm very skeptical and pessimistic about the Commission's impact and its role. It's good, Eddie, that you mentioned the rule of law reporting. Just to give you an idea of how it functions, all started back in 2013 when the Commission launched its first anti-corruption report. It was issued in 2014. The second edition was drafted in 2017 and it remained in the chest and wardrobe of Timmermans, because member states were so anxious and felt offended about being named and shamed and labeled as doing a bad job against corruption. So the Commission just shut down the whole project of anti-corruption reporting. Instead, it jumped in with the rule of law reporting, which is a very soft law, diplomatically turned mission with a lot of understatements, and it truly has hardly any impact on what is happening. Well, knowing that Hungary is a country of many informalities, I'm pretty sure that Mr. Orban has already done a lot to make his system survive, even from opposition. It's called the deep state or I don't know, privatization, outsourced state architecture, which is happening in Hungary. What we observe is a weird mixture of an obsession with centralization of power, with a government with overwhelming powers, which actually privatizes or corporatizes a lot of missions and duties to do into state-funded organizations, corporations, newly endowed and newly established public trust funds, which are nominally private entities with a lot of public duties and with immense amounts of public funds. Now, how can all this be addressed institutionally? And well, knowing that the Commission, the European Commission, has had a long dream and a belated waking up with the rule of law reporting, with the conditionality mechanism, and with EPPO, I'm quite sure that my skepsis is right, that if all these are happening together, this will not prevent Hungary from going forward or going even more downward on the trajectory, on the slippery slope, directing the country to an even more authoritarian regime. What the EU, the Commission, could do, I'm afraid it will not, but it should at least, is the ending of unconditional funding of Hungary and other regimes of alike. It's a very delicate situation for a citizen of Hungary to say that the best way to save Hungary from going down the drain is to kind of starve the nation and the economy of Hungary by not giving EU transfers. We have to bear in mind that, surprisingly, at least surprising to me, not being an economist or an analyst, that the economy of Hungary is doing pretty good. It has been. In the pre-COVID period, there was a 5-6 years of almost uninterrupted economic growth with a high investment rate. And even though it now seems that without EU funding and transfers coming from the Commission, the economy is in a bad situation, is in a problem. But foreign investors seem to be very happy.
Can I push you a bit on this question of the speed of the EU action and their decisiveness or their lack of decisiveness? I mean, the treaties, of course, guarantee the Commission complete discretion in when it brings cases to the courts. And one of the issues we've had is that between the time of something happening, between the infringement proceeding being launched, between the dialogue that has to precede the infringement proceeding, there are a lot of opportunities to drop the ball. And what could we do to speed up action by the Commission so that it's more time? We have the CU, for example, too late. The NGO regulation too late. By the time the judgments came back.
Well, basically, my more or less optimistic answer would have focused on awareness raising in the society at large and not doing advocacy, whether a bottom-up or a boardroom type in regards the European Commission, because I'm really skeptical if the Commission is determined to take timely and hard-handed action. The only tool so far, which seems to be, well, if not decisive, at least having an impact, is the bargaining process which surrounds the RRF, the resilience and fund that is addressing the COVID-related crisis, which reveals that the EU has already the tools, and it has always had the tools within reach and in hands to stop funding Hungary, to say that we don't need conditionality mechanism, we don't need rule of law mechanism, we don't need infringement processes. We just say that if you are not complying with the expectations in public procurement processes, ineffective corruption, ineffective prosecution of corruption, in judicial independence, we are not giving you the money, because this is the only language this regime is understanding.
Okay, so follow the money, withdraw the money, big central issue. Now, I just wanted to move on to Krzysztof, who's at the other end of the accountability spectrum, the question of independent judiciary, prosecution authorities, of course, and what can be done to prevent the erosion of independent judiciary in places where, perhaps not in Hungary and Poland, where it might be too late, but in other places where there is still...
Yeah, it should be easy, right? No, it's not. Thank you for having me here and having this conference on the very timely topics, I think, because still an obvious thing, the election is for most of the people the most important part of democracy. But the problem with elections is nowadays, basically, that the electoral campaign starts the very same day or the day after tomorrow, after voting, basically. This is, I think, the biggest challenge that we have in the electoral NGO experts, the observance community, because we have to observe elections in this understanding for 4 or 5 years, actually, every day. And this is what Olga said in her speech. That democracy should be defended all the time. And I think this is one of the reasons, if I make a small diagnosis here, one of the reasons we are failing in terms of having the hybrid regimes is also we not really taking into account the necessity of protecting democracy every day. And then that includes the independence of judiciary. The very first thing that my government, the government of Poland, did in 2015 after they gained power was hacking the constitutional tribunal. It was a similar case in Hungary, right? The independence of judiciary. So it started with the constitutional tribunal because you don't have to have constitutional majority to overrule if you have a constitutional tribunal. So this is, I think, the most important thing to be aware of, which I know everyone and each of you is aware, but I think it's important to
might, for example, there be possibilities of intervention in countries that, unlike Poland, don't have a reservation on the Charter of Fundamental Rights?
Yeah, I mean, the topic of the Charter of Fundamental Rights.
Polish question there, but in other countries, might there be ways to?
Yes, I mean, we can, and to be very honest, I mean, the NGO community or the expert community in Poland, they are trying also their best to involve the EU institutions and use also, whatever to a certain extent is possible, the Fundamental Rights Charter. But still, I mean, I think as Miklós, I'm super disappointed towards EU. I mean, and we have to also openly say it. Especially we have some EU Western audience probably with us, because I mean it's kind of not understandable for me, because the part of the hybrid regime in Europe or in the EU particularly is destroying the EU actually, and EU is trying to be this good mother with a carrot, not with a stick, and it allows basically for the countries and states and governments to play in their own rules, which are not the rules based on the common European values. And I think this is also something that we have to speak up. What would be my recommendation here? Also talk about reforming the EU. I mean, we're so afraid of doing it actually, because the EU sounds, the last resort. But probably like my Hungarian colleagues, I'm a bit disappointed. I see a lot of instruments. I have a good cooperation with MEPs, but also the European Parliament is kind of toothless, right? I mean, this is also the part of the EU problem here. So I would expect much more from the EU here. But also, when we talk about it, when we talk about the rule of law, the independence of judiciary, a lack of independent prosecution office, we are ourselves undermining the trust towards the state and elections. And the second thought I have for you is also be aware that it's really hard for us as, again, expert NGO pro-democratic community to balance between pointing out all the irregularities, corruption, lack of rule of law, and not undermining the process of elections at the same time, because the disappointed people will just not participate in the election. And this is what politicians want. This is the political campaigns. Not only they are now taking place every day, but also they are concentrated on mobilizing or demobilizing electorates. So it's really hard, and I don't have a perfect recommendation here, but one of them would be make democracy fun again. I mean, this is also our failure. We don't think, we are afraid of thinking in a political ways, basically. We try to be, very accurate, we're just documenting things, which is important. This is part of my job, is to documenting the lack of rule of law, lack of transparency, corruption. But also, I think we openly should say we are political. We have a vision. We have a vision that democracy, it's actually the coolest system in the world, right? And for some reason, I think we're not really succeeding in that, because one thing is to protect the independence of judiciary and the prosecution, to help politicians accountable, to be sure that the election process is fair. But on the other hand, I mean, the people have to vote on something, and this something should be fun in a way. I know I'm simplifying stuff.
So here we have a nice set of recommendations for everyone before we throw it out to all of you who are just as experts as we are up here on the panel. And so we have make democracy fun, get political, in other words, less academic, more politics. We have use the single market mechanisms more within the EU. We have this other question. Well, you said there were no solutions. So Nothing can be done from this quarter. Yeah.
The system can be paralyzed if funding ends.
So cut off the money. There we go.
Follow the money.
Starve the beast, as Ronald Reagan used to say. And then, so let's now, I think, bring this out up to the floor. We have, apart from Zofia and Mindaugas, who have been asking all the questions, every panel, we'll get to you. But who else? There's a wealth of expertise in this room. And I encourage you all to put up your hands and suggest something. And if, yeah, lady at the back.
Fear of touching, and how do you convince people? What is your best argument to convince people that strengthening democracy, strengthening the electoral process, is about human rights? People that do not really that think that elections has to do with the parties, the politicians. Let's not touch that. How do you convince them that it's about human rights by every person's right to actually participate in ruling it? Article 21. What are the best arguments?
Participation. I have a couple more questions to bring them to the panel, or, yep. You, yeah.
Kind of intrusions that we see in Hungary and Poland, and how important are academics for solutions?
Thank you. And now let's go to Mindaugas. I know who's an incredibly political person, always give us a political...
Go away from this political thing. But what you mentioned, and we read here, countering state capture. My question is for both for Poland and probably Hungary. Can we identify the real losers from this state capture? I understand you would answer all the society loses and experts and NGOs and democracy, whatever. But the nature of these regimes is to bring the benefit to the few, for Orban's friends, and spread the cost across the society. And then if it only few foreigners, then I don't care. So can we identify any interest groups, companies, tight-knit communities which are losing considerably, and they have prompted for some action against the state capture?
So here's the question: Who are the losers? Apart from obviously academic institutions, who are relevant, who are clearly losing out. What are the solutions for academic freedom in this kind of situation? And finally, how do we all, get people to realize that politics is their business too? It's not like hairdressing to be done by specialists, and you do it every so often when you need a haircut. It's how does it belong to everyone? So let's start. Actually, Mike.
Yeah, that last question actually really interested me in terms of who's the losers, and thinking about some of the other captured regimes, whether it be the hybrid regimes down to the authoritarian regimes. And one trend that we've been seeing, those of us at Freedom House, is environmentalists. They're losing out big, and this will have long-term repercussions for democracy going forward. I mean, climate change is its own problem for democracy that we all need to figure out. We should probably have multiple separate conferences on that, of how do we address this collective problem. But we're seeing the way in which the decisions made by these captured elites are impacting local ecological issues in Russia, in Serbia, in Albania, in all of these countries. And there are these new sort of green parties, environmentalist parties that are coming out, speaking out about this. but they really don't have the political power to push back. And I worry that it's only going to take time until society comes around to recognize that everybody's losing when it comes to environmental issues. So that's one thing that comes to mind.
Krzysztof, you, in many ways, the question reflected yours about get political. So, what I'd say one of the sort of things that both academia and civil society has, and one of the reasons they have trust, is they don't get involved in like the immediate politicization of everything. So, what's the role for like politicizing things at a system level, if you like? This is not about whether you vote for Fidesz or the opposition. This is about the structure of, Hungarian democracy, for example. Is that even possible to conceive of in a situation where one of the sides, whether it be Fidesz or PiS or something else, is undermining democratic institutions? Where's the space for politicization but trust?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, what I said before, we shouldn't be afraid of the word polarization. Actually, we should be political. I mean, everything is political in the sense, especially in these discussions. I think what we're doing extensively too much is that we are trying to be indifferent and play indifferent. We only talk about the process. We just want fair elections. But the truth is, and this is one of the reasons, I guess, we are talking about this context, that we are calling the hybrid regimes, which have a negative connotation, that we don't like them. We want to change them. So we also have to have the vision for what we want to change. And I think we lack of it. We try to, escape from the main discussion.
Okay, what do you want to change?
Oh, for sure, it's maybe an individual opinion, but I would say we need, and it's naive I know still, but there was a guy 2 years ago in US that succeeded with this actually, talking more about the hope. I mean, we're very negative. I mean, everything is bad, which is most of the cases true. I mean, there is corruption, but also, I mean, people don't like negative guys, right? And girls. I mean, we need to give hope. And I would also say, and this is my, political statement in a way, I wouldn't go, as like a lot of oppositional parties, go from illiberal democracies to neoliberal democracies. I think there is something in between, right? And this is what people, I think, expect. And that's why illiberal regimes, very often, they don't need to capture the state, because the narrative they have brings the hope, give the hope people. So I would say this, and we can do it with academics. I mean, they have a lot of, good ideas, diagnoses, and are able to draw these wider policy frameworks, that we can be more concrete, with the ideas. But this would be my political agenda. I still think we have to call it this way and don't shy away from this.
Edith, I think two of the questions here were specifically designed for you. The one about academia and the one about, I don't want to say this the wrong way, identifying losers, because you brought that up very strongly at the beginning of your thing. There's these disadvantaged communities that are being victimized by them.
And I didn't want to make it very academic, but I cannot help myself but bring in the populism paradigm, because this is something which I haven't been talking about here, but I think it's strictly related to all the phenomena we're discussing here. So both the Polish and the Hungarian government, what they're doing is that they're dividing the society between two homogeneous group, like the deserving good people and the corrupt elites. And whoever is not with them is with the corrupt elites. So this is what we see vertically, but it also works horizontally. So when I was talking about the poor people who are being completely excluded, it's not just throughout the electoral procedure that they're being intimidated and there is coercive vote buying. But at the same time, for instance, when it comes to the community in Hungary, we are talking about the politically most polarized, deprived, and as I mentioned, pushed into the poverty trap kind of people. Very easy to exploit them. I'm not saying that they're all victims of coercive vote buying. It's not always like that. It's just the way how they live their life. They feel it's so miserable that it's like a clear patron-clientelistic kind of relationship from which they can hardly withdraw. So what I'm saying is that And I think what the local opposition and the civil society could pursue a little bit like further, it's very important to give a real political voice to these people and to make sure to foster a more inclusive decision making when it comes to collective decision making. Because if we exclude these people out from the decision making, they're not really being represented in political, like these decision making bodies, neither on the national level or on the local level. At the end of the day, it's the easiest way to buy them votes and to tell them that if you're not supporting the ruling elite, you're not going to be able to get a job or to survive in the long run. So I think a lot more inclusive approach would be needed. And I think that's kind of like a homework that the Hungarian opposition would certainly need to do. And when it comes to like academic freedom, I still see a little bit slightly more hope in Poland than in Hungary. What I've noticed is that like this kind of repression on the representatives of the academy is rather like self-censorship that they're imposing on themselves. It's not prevailing on the systemic level from the side of the government, but the question is like how far we're gonna get. And
and there's an appetite for this.
Power structure is a lot centralized and polycentric, and it's a lot more difficult for Kaczynski to push through all the things that Viktor Orban has been just achieving because of the multi-level governance system. And there is a president who is from time to time at least slowing things down, and there are also local governances. So what I think is that this is crucial, because I think one of the key elements of undermining democracy in these countries were like they were trying to capture the referees, not only the judiciary, but also academics, civil society representatives, journalists. So I think we can unfortunately all put them in the same basket. And this is utmost important that, to try to prevent it. As I said, there are no easy answers. I'm not sure how to do this, either top down or bottom up, but probably more bottom up initiatives would be helpful.
Our Democrat at the back wants to come back with something.
Supports elections. They're afraid they will support more social progress. So afraid that we're actually. So I was not convincing people, stakeholders. Maybe that's a specific Swedish problem. Maybe other countries will understand.
From Transparency International, working in this kind of thing, well, we're doing anti-corruption. They're like, well, hold on, it's not quite anti-poverty. Maybe it's a bit more politicized here. So what would you say?
Again, I don't have a perfect answer to you, because before the precision of your question, my answer would have been Hungarians are pretty mobilized. I mean, the 70% rate of participation at the elections is quite high in Hungary, and the opposition, without any major or stable, let alone robust infrastructure, could include and mobilize a lot of volunteers to do on-site election observation mission in the voters' districts. So it worked. It didn't suffice. It didn't work in the end. It didn't result in an opposition victory. Actually, it resulted in a fourth repeated landslide for Viktor Orban. And the fact that 3 million Hungarians did vote for Viktor Orban means that Hungarians are pretty involved in politics. But for the precision of your question, for stakeholder involvement, I actually have no good answer. From TI Hungary's perspective, Swedish stakeholders seem to be quite involved and engaged with things going on in Hungary. At least we have a lot of very important collaborations and a lot of support coming from Sweden, and the embassy and to other stakeholders. But I also have a thing to add, to contribute to the question who loses out on the system. Because I don't understand, I don't agree fully on your description that the gang is winning and society at large is losing. Actually, I'm afraid that's the vision the Hungarian opposition has, and this is resulting in repeated dead ends and lockdowns and major defeats, because there are a number of horizontal benefits disbursed in the society, which you get. And Mr. Orban of Fidesz is not caring whether you vote for them or not. You get tax rebates, you get childcare allowance, you get cheap energy, or at least the promise that energy is coming cheap, the carbon utility prices, which is a fake, but many Hungarians believe. And you don't need to be a Fidesz voter to believe that the energy is coming cheap. And there are obviously groups in society who lose this out, like educational healthcare professionals. The whole thing about teaching the upcoming generations and education. I think that's personal and not TI take. It's my personal take on that. That as long as Hungarians are individual, the system doesn't care if they are pro-Fidesz or not. They get the horizontal benefits. As soon as they get grouped up like education professionals, healthcare professionals, the system reaction is that if you are a pressure group and you can blackmail or extort the system, you get something. If you are not able to extort the system, you are just set aside. Now the educational system is getting Mr. Pintér, Interior Minister, and an old, bloody, hard-fisted communist from the 70s, once a Communist Party secretary of the Interior Ministry from the mid-80s. So he knows how to deal with these things. And the message here is that now you get Mr. Pintér. Be happy with that.
Okay, on that, and that's now happy with Mr. Pintér. Let's go around to another. I think Zsofi is desperate now to make a point here. And then we've got the lady as well in the flowery top after Zsofi. But Zsofi first, and then you.
Are there any country democracy? And it's a question. You want democracy? Is it enough to have the French rule?
Great question. I mean, at least according to our report, Nations in Transit, we do not have a good example of a country transiting. We don't like the term nations in transit. These countries aren't transiting towards democracy anymore. Let's be real. We don't have a good example of that. We do see incremental progress in places like Kosovo, Armenia, Ukraine, but it's coming up against these problems of either entrenched interests, parties that have been there for 30 years that are kind of pushing back on this reformist mindset, or in some cases, foreign powers like Russia pushing back on Ukrainian democracy. So unfortunately, I don't have a lot of good news there. And sorry, what was the other part of your question?
No, I just wanted to intervene on that because I think I do have an example of this, which, with apologies to the guy from the Irish embassy, because I doubt it's official Irish policy. I would argue that Ireland in the 80s and 90s had significant characteristics of the hybrid regime. I'll just give you a couple of examples. One is there was an attempt by the then Prime Minister to put his family lawyer in as President of the Supreme Court. This failed. There were another one from the 70s. There was what was known as the sleeping judge case. So we had a special anti-terrorist court, and there was 3 judges, no jury. One of the judges fell asleep. The other 2 judges ignored it. This then went up to the Supreme Court, and they ruled that, well, the 2 judges that were there said the guy was awake, so we can only address issues of law, and so the ruling stood even though one of the judges fell asleep. We also had a outside the legal sphere. I don't know how many of you know Father Ted, the TV show. The reason Father Ted exists is because Dermot Morgan, who played Father Ted, used to be a satirical radio commentator, and the reason he ended up going to England and becoming this relatively lowbrow comedian and admittedly making lots of money was that he was pushed out of the state TV for being too satirical and too hostile and too effective a satirist. So these are things that exist in other countries as well. If you have more contested power, shorter periods of hegemony by particular parties, you often end up with more contest and more institutions. Maybe this puts it back to elections. What you need is regular alternation of the elites at the top, and that keeps everyone a bit more honest. But I'll shut up now and pass it over to the lady in the flowery top, who's been waiting very patiently.
My name is Violeta Vaida. I work for the National Democratic Institute, and I'm really pleased to hear the discussion about actually how do you shift these regimes. I was very happy to hear Edith talk about the role of cities. And we actually work in Hungary and in Poland with cities to try to figure out how citizens can get more involved at the local level in local democracy. And what we're seeing is that that's a layer that is really, really working in this region. And so the more muscle, the more democracy muscle you can give to the cities, and the more democracy muscle you can give to citizens, it seems to make a difference. So actually, my question is, can you see that at the macro level? Does it work, or can we only see it from the practitioner level?
Mike's already jumping in.
Yeah, no, this is the one piece of good news I actually have. Our report this year is local democratic governance as a driver of change. It was the one category of all the categories that we assessed that improved across all of these countries. And so we do see instances of places like in Croatia, where local reformers come to power, they address the real issues, not the politicized, polarized issues that are happening at the national level, but the local issues of local corruption and problems that are happening. Of course, once they get into power, they have this double problem of not only building democratic norms and practices, but also undoing the rot of the previous corrupt regimes. So it's a real challenge, but it does seem that there is at least a driver, potential for momentum from the local level up to the national level. And they can build experience at the local level to then work their way up to the national level. We see that in places like Hungary, for instance. Maybe it didn't work out in the end, but we see how local pockets of independence at the local level can, in the end, impact national level governance.
Right.
Well, the thing is that in 2019, there was a minor landslide in Hungary due to municipal elections. 1/3 of the population of Hungary now lives in cities and settlements under non-government leadership. Budapest being the big liberal bubble with many districts as the biggest example for that. But it were high hopes fading away. The government immediately reacted, reshifting power, restructuring finances. To put it mildly, the government is currently suffocating municipalities. But even apart from that, TIA Hungary, in coalition with other NGOs, had a so-called "This is the Minimum" program, an anti-corruption pledge for municipalities. It didn't cost any money. It's just about being open and transparent and putting up information on municipal websites. Well, those municipalities which pledged for this program, the candidates during the 2019 campaign who signed up to be more transparent, who got in power after the elections, well, we can blame it on COVID that they didn't have the time to do that. But it's halftime now. We just made a follow-up assessment of how they progressed in this program, and the progress is zero. And there are some achievements in transparency of how municipalities are functioning, like decisions and some contracts. But municipally-owned enterprises, which is a huge exposure to corruption and a huge possibility to do things better. Even opposition-led municipalities said quite openly that there is no way that they are going to open up any information related to the finances and businesses of these companies, even though those outside of the sphere of our pledge campaign, those require some transparency of these companies and of these corporations. But no one enforces that, and even opposition-led municipalities overtly say that we are not going to comply with that regulation. So there is hope that municipalities can do things better, But in Hungary, these hopes are fading away.
So Krzysztof had his hand up first, then you. So
Okay, yeah. I think the topic of decentralization is crucial. I mean, this is the proof, basically, and I'm very far from, being an idealist. I know there's a lot of also working for years with municipalities. There's a big problem with transparency. There's the big problem with sharing the power. But still, I mean, this is a kind of the municipality or the commune is a natural laboratory of the civic participation. And very often, again, we are complaining that this shrinking civic space, that people are not participating, they're not active, not volunteering. But if you look at the local level, and by local level, I mean very local level, so like schools, right, your area, the playgrounds, whatever, the people are really coming involved. I mean, I don't expect anyone to, just be active in the Poland NGO and observe elections. It would be fun, but still, I think the core of democracy is also to try, and this is a part of your first question, actually, on how to convince people, which I don't think is very convincing, is the part of the dignity of the human being. So the source of the human rights is basically that you can decide about yourself and your surroundings. And I think this is the opportunity you have in municipalities. And also because there is this competition between the, let's call them liberal municipalities and illiberal central governments, this is a good opportunity to try to convince them to introduce even more of these tools and participatory tools. And this is also the laboratory that can convince people that democracy is fun and actually you have an influence on your situation and your surrounding. And very last thing, also what we are witnessing in Poland, the whole conflict and also the central government is trying really in a way to undermine the position of the self-government and this decentralization report that we had a few years ago. And we can observe the big unity between representatives of different municipalities and also exchange of knowledge, exchange of experiences, inspiring each other. And the last thing, also it's really interesting when we talk about decentralization to look at the Ukraine. I mean, the big part of the Ukrainian success is the decentralization reform. Every time you hear the news from cities, it's basically you also have to be aware that the resilience there is also being provided by the people from the self-government and the local citizens organized around it. So I think this is a good proof that we don't only can talk about democracy, but actually a very resilient, effective political organism.
Thank you. I can only just sign up to what Krzysztof said because, first of all, I think for me as a Hungarian, this is like a tragedy that one of the greatest achievements of decentralization also in Hungary, of course not to the extent of Poland, it has been undermined and local autonomies have been stripped of their independences and financial and political autonomies in Hungary. And what Krzysztof said, it's important because it's not only like a very viral, like political communities, even civil society organizations are the most active on the local level in Poland, which shows how much it is decentralized and polycentric, which is, I think, like a fundamental element of the viral, I would say, at least maintaining, so to say, or slowing down democratic backsliding in the country where the national government is willingly trying to do that. But I think, I agree with Miklós that we also see some promising light in Hungary too, because despite how much they have been stripped of their independences financially and politically, right now I'm working on a research project on how local level, political opposition is trying to mitigate national level populism. And we have been identifying many interesting initiatives from the level of Budapest and many other cities, the way how they are trying to undercut the logic of this kind of dividing the society between the undeserving bad and the deserving good people. So like, for instance, participatory budgeting, like trying to include and like engage them more in the decision making, I think it's super important, but not only from this financial and fiscal perspective, but the way how they're trying to change the political culture on the local level, to trying to make it more inclusive, not to think like this kind of barbaric way of us and them, but try to make decisions together, try to move forward together, because I'm afraid that if we're not going to have this kind of approach, even if it sounds very idealistic, this is simply impossible to, as I said, undercut the logic of populism and to keep them off power and in the long run to replace the government.
Thank you, Edith. I think that's an excellent point of which to end. I'm very sorry we've got running out of time, and the next panel is due to start in a second. But the defeat of populism needs hard work. It needs to go out and engage directly with communities. It needs to do what has been called the rubber chicken circuit. You need to go out to all the villages. You need to talk to people. You need to have meetings. You need to eat terrible food while persuading people to get more involved in politics. That's what you need to do. So I leave you with that thought as we all move on to our next panel.